I always thought that Flexbox and CSS Grid were the best inventions since the flushing toilet, because before you had to, with the diffs, which are all inline elements, so they all push each other to the next line. It's very hard to do boxes next to boxes or have a layout that's responsive when you open it that syncs a line. We had to float left or float right and all these different things that we had to build. And now there's a new system called CSS grids. And I think it's so easy. Imagine you had to divide it into 4 columns. You had 25% on each of the 100% on view width, but you wanted to put a margin. Now that margin would be added to your 100%, so it'd be outside your page. So you had to make all of your columns something like 24% or 20, like something you had to math out, and it was impossible to get the right number because you could never really tell which viewport people were on. So things never really quite aligned. Now with CSS grids, you can divide it up in fractions instead. And then you can add a grid gap in between, and it just takes away from that fraction. So it perfectly aligns into 4 columns with the margin, with the grid gap in between of those. No more math, no more lining up for pixels. There's a tutorial by Wes Boss that I find really helpful for me. There are other ones, but this one I thought was relatively easy to understand, relatively easy. I think it's so easy, but then there are, of course, so many different options to do it that after you go through the whole tutorial, you're more confused than before. But you can kind of choose the way that you like to build it and stick to that and become an expert at your way to do it. Just keep in mind that there are countless other ways to do it, but the basic ones, I like to have one that's very visual, where you just write out, you give each of the elements a name, and then you just like on the bottom here, you can see, you can just write out the layout of these elements. So the tutorial by Wes Boss, I'll give you the link in the bottom. If you sign up to the newsletter, it's free. There's also Grid by Example. They have a lot of examples that explain it really well. CSS Tricks, one of my favorite websites. I Google this one all the time. It has such a good documentation. You could go also to the Mozilla Network, Firefox, and there's even a game called Grid Garden where you can practice your knowledge of the CSS grid in a game. So I made a tutorial in a Codepen in the next video where I show you a basic grid. So it's really not that hard. You can start with an example grid and then you can expand to more of the details if you want to. But there's not that much. The code isn't really that hard. It's very visual. It's really easy to understand for me. I must have mentioned that like 10 times. It's really easy to make it responsive, which in these days is very convenient.